Matt Hancock, welcome to the Freedom Pack podcast.
It's great to be here.
So this is first and foremost a personal development podcast, so I think the best place to start, what is the biggest or most important thing you've learned about yourself in the past 12 months?
Wow, in the past 12 months, I tell you, it's definitely not to be in a hurry. That's the number one thing, without doubt. You know, I've had a lot more time on my hands, obviously, and I've spent a lot more time in my constituency, you know, and I absolutely love that job. But you know, I've always worked very hard, and I've always been pushing, and now I've got a bit more time for not to be in such a rush.
Yeah. Well, your background is an extremely interesting one, and if we had more time, I'd love to dive into all of that. But I think the best place to start is you've entered into a career where you knew right from the start you were going to face criticism, sometimes even hate. Why would you choose to put yourself through that?
Oh, well, that's easy, right? And it's been really highlighted actually in the last few months with what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And that's that, you know, the way that we as a democracy move things forward is by having a big debate about it. And part of that debate is to have a row sometimes. And sometimes everybody agrees, as it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes they do. And you know, there's some issues I work cross-party on, like my Dyslexia campaign. But there's other times when things are highly contentious. And in a democracy, you have a big row about it. Inevitably, the people who have big voices in that debate get criticised. Now, I don't like the personal criticism, but as you say, it comes with the territory. I do think it would be far better if we could have a politics based more on respectful disagreement on substantive arguments, rather than, you know, playing the man, not the ball, so to speak. But it does come with the territory. I think it would be far better if there was less of that, and then we might get the better decisions. And I think it puts off some people from going into politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a lot of preconceived ideas or stigma around politicians. What is maybe one sort of preconceived idea of a politician that you wish more people challenge themselves?
Oh, I think that that politicians are a group apart from society. Okay. I mean, because I think the irony is politicians are more embedded in their communities than most people. Yesterday I was doing a constituency surgery and just outside Newmarket, you know, dealing with the day-to-day issues that people have. It's actually a really rewarding part of the job that hardly ever gets debated and talked about. It's one of those uncontentious bits, right? Because everybody from every party does it, and I think most find it very, very rewarding. So the idea that is portrayed that people who go into politics are therefore different to normal people is just completely wrong. The body of people you find in Parliament are, you know, come from all parts of society, and have all the both attributes and flaws that all people do. We're all human.
So would you say you have a genuine desire to help people?
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons I came into politics, but it's also one of the reasons I'm staying in politics. You know, I've been in one of those big jobs with a big duty during the pandemic as health secretary, and one of the rewarding things I found of being back on the back benches is actually you get to help people in a more tangible way, not just big picture policy, you know, and setting national policy, but you know, helping individuals, and whether that's the constituency work, but also the dyslexia campaign. You know, I'm dyslexic. I want to make life better for dyslexic people, especially, you know, the fact that only 1 in 5 dyslexic kids get identified at school, right? And then working with Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary, Will Quince, the Minister for this area, we changed government policy, and that's very rewarding, and that will help people. We've got to make it happen on the ground, but that will help people, and that I find that I find that very rewarding.
Yeah, you mentioned the dyslexia campaign there. Why is that so important to you and your own experience with dyslexia?
Yeah, so it matters to me because I'm dyslexic, and because for me I only found out about my dyslexia when I was at university, and the being told that I was dyslexic was a big moment in my life, because it made sense of a load of things that, you know, I was rubbish at languages, but I was good at maths, and I couldn't understand why there was such a big disparity between the two, and it made a lot of sense of a lot of things. So it was an important moment for me, but it only came when I was 18 and had gone to university. And then I discovered this is still true. This is what happens. And endless people have come to me and said, I only found out when I was at university, I only found out when I went into a job, or I was in my 30s. I was talking to Jackie Stewart, the racing driver, and he only found out that he was dyslexic when he took his son for a dyslexia assessment. This still goes on, and it's got to change. So that's it. So it's, it is. I'm doing that work directly because it affected me and my life, and I now want to make sure that doesn't happen to children coming through the system, that everybody gets the support they need from primary school.
So what is the end goal with that? What would have to happen for you to consider that a successful campaign?
Yeah, so the central thing I want to see is I want to make sure that every child at primary school gets screened, so that those who are likely to have dyslexia can get the assessment they need, can get the teaching that they need that works for the way that their brain works, and that we get the teacher training that goes alongside that. So it's the universal screening, so that teachers have the information that they need, and at the same time the teachers need the training they need. That is absolutely central to it. I mean, there's other parts of the campaign as well, like saying to employers, you should be looking to employ people who are neurodiverse, because you can get, better decisions are made generally when people who think differently come together. And there's a strand of the work because on the criminal justice system, because unfortunately, a lot of people who are dyslexic and don't learn to read as well as enough to function effectively. Too many of them end up in prison, and they need the support. We've literally got a captive audience, and we should be teaching people to read in prison if they haven't learned to read yet. And there's a big proportion of prisoners in that space. So they're the three strands: business, prison, and education. But the education one is at the centre, because if you can fix that, then you fix it. You fix it for people for life.
So how much better or more effective do you feel you work when the work you're doing is meaningful?
Oh God, unbelievable! It makes all the difference, doesn't it? I mean, for me, it makes all the difference, because it's about motivation, and you can't throw yourself into something unless you think there's a good reason for it.
And did that translate during the pandemic, during those days where I'm sure they were busy days where you had to stay resilient? Did that help feed that resilience? Yeah,
and people used to say to me, you must be really tired. And I was working 18-hour days, but we concentrated hard on getting enough sleep, getting food, the basics, especially in the really tough times. I didn't feel tired. I felt motivated. Not because it was a good thing we were facing, but because it was a huge thing that needed to be addressed. And nobody becomes health secretary wanting to be health secretary in a pandemic. But when the balloon goes up on your watch, you're the one who's got to deal with it. And so there was a real team spirit amongst the team at the top. There was a real motivation to get it right. And to try to communicate as effectively as possible sometimes quite difficult messages, sometimes quite complicated scientific messages, and a combination of the politicians and also brilliant clinical advisors, people like Chris Whitty, Jonathan Van Tam, to make sure we both made the decisions as well as we could in the fog of uncertainty, but then communicating. So there was a massive sense of mission, yes.
Okay, so we talked about that resilience. We talked about how important that was during the pandemic. What did a typical working day look like for Matt Hancock during the pandemic?
Well, during the heat of the pandemic, I more or less worked. I worked about 18 hours. I got up in the morning. I did everything I could. And then I went to bed at night and got up and did the same. I mean, that's there were times when even my loo breaks were scheduled in the diary.
Wow.
And because I'd be in the office in the Department for Health, I'd be in Downing Street talking to the Prime Minister and his team. I'd be in Parliament trying to explain things to Parliament and answering questions from MPs. That was really important that we kept that going all the way through. And I went between those three venues more or less constantly, it felt. And then, I'd get out and about as much as I could, but obviously during the lockdowns that wasn't possible. So that was and there were just so many different subjects on which decisions were needed. And the whole thing was, the timetable was programmed down to the last minute.
I think everyone with a stressful job can relate to this question, but what did your time as Health Secretary during a pandemic do to your mental health? Did it have an effect at all?
Well, no, not really, because of the mission, we had purpose. We sure had purpose.
Well, obviously it was a difficult task, but on top of that, in a position that you were in, you were, of course, doing many interviews. There was a lot of media attention.
Yeah.
Every eye in the nation was on you at times.
Yeah.
And with certain media outlets, you get a level of gotcha journalism.
Do you?
How do you manage to navigate something like that when you accept an interview, going into it knowing that they want a specific angle from?
Yeah. Well, there's a particular, there's an art to it. There's an art to it. The first thing, and especially in a pandemic, is you have to answer the questions directly.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, this is a debate in politics, and there's times when the interviewer specifically is trying to get you to say something because they know it'll create a fuss and headlines, and you don't want to say it, or you don't think it. In a pandemic, it was slightly different. It was like. It was more public health communications. It was about how do we communicate what's going on about something that affects everybody's lives. So in a way, it wasn't the normal politics. It wasn't politics. It wasn't party politics. It was public health communications. So during the worst bits, that natural tendency dissipated.
This is a question I've longed for the answer to, and you might be the perfect person to ask. Why would anyone accept an invitation to an interview with Piers Morgan?
Oh, because I respect the viewers. That's why. That's the long and short of it. A lot of people in the morning, watch BBC Breakfast or listen to Virgin Radio. A lot of people watch GMB, and I needed to communicate with them. It was my job. It was my duty. Now, Piers, has his views, and but that was my job.
So, obviously, when this first came, it was New Year's Day. The news started to come out of China.
Yeah. What
What was your initial reaction? Did you think that it could possibly be as big as it was?
Well, so it was so uncertain at first. That's the word I use, uncertain. Yeah, I as you know, I heard about it on New Year's Day, and asked questions about it, and we had a meeting about it that week. But it was uncertainty. That was we knew so little.
Yeah. And when did the severity of the situation really hit home for you?
Pretty soon, but it was especially after we'd seen the scenes in Italy. That was when we really knew that this was coming.
Now, being in a position right at the start, there's very little data to go off.
Yeah.
obviously the data that was given to you, how do you begin to navigate that and use that in a decision making process?
The data was absolutely brilliant by the end. Yeah. Basically, we started with nothing at all, and we built some really strong data tools and analytical tools. And we also put a lot of effort into how that was presented to try to understand it as quickly as possible. And we also put a lot of effort into how to publish that in a way that it would be accurately understood. I think the vaccine project actually was the sort of the best example of this, because it came, the vaccine obviously only got rolled out just under a year after the pandemic struck. So from the start of the vaccine rollout, we had a really good data underpinning, both for analytical reasons and for operational purposes. So the data was absolutely critical. And the answer to how is, that we put a lot of effort in, and we brought in people who had great data experience.
Did the Chinese lockdown influence the UK's hand?
Well, obviously we saw that lockdown, but the real impact actually was when it was obviously so big in Italy. That's when we really knew it was coming to the UK for sure, and we saw different ways to manage it. And there was a big debate about all the different ways around the world, but I wouldn't single out any one country.
So obviously you had two sides of the public criticising. Some say they weren't soon enough, we didn't lock down soon enough. Some say you're taking our freedoms away. How do you strike the balance?
Well, that is the right word, balance, right? But ultimately, you've got to look at the data, you've got to listen to the scientists, and you've got to do what you think is right. And sometimes the broad swathe of opinion is going to be with you, and sometimes not. But in something as big as that, where as many lives are at stake, your goal is to get these decisions as right as you can in unprecedented circumstances without much data. That's and of course that will be scrutinised and there'll be debate about it. And then the job, again, going back to it, is to explain to the public why you've taken the decision that you have. But balance is a critical thing.
Okay, so we're short on time. The last question I'll ask you: what is your advice to a future health secretary who may find themselves in the middle of a public health crisis?
Well, the number one thing that I think is vital is that the inquiry leads to a manual on the shelf, if you like, that the person in my shoes next time, and there will be a next time, can take this manual off the shelf, and it's like, this is how we did it last time. And there'll be changes, of course there will, and hopefully some of the technologies will be improved, and there'll be things like a testing system ready to go, which didn't exist at all effectively. But the critical thing is to have that manual, because there's no one answer to your question. There's hundreds of pages of answers to different bits, each pandemic will be different, but I hope that we can have those lessons learned.
Okay. Matt Hancock, thank you so much for joining me on the Freedom Pack podcast today.
Great stuff. Thank you very much for having me on.